Come on in, pull up a chair, and take a load off because today I'll be reviewing and paging through Call of Cthulhu Horror on the Orient Express from Chaosium Inc. Is this essentially a must-own campaign for Call of Cthulhu Keepers of all stripes? Or will you find your sanity shaken as you scream in horror attempting to run this massive role-playing game campaign? Well, you're going to find out right after this. Howdy, 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 gang. Welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. As mentioned in the open, today I am going to be reviewing the 2-volume hardcover set of Call of Cthulhu Horror on the Orient Express from Chaosium Inc. This is for 7th edition Call of Cthulhu. These two hardcovers do total 768 pages. The set can be had for $89.99. And the PDF is available over at DriveThruRPG for $39.99. Although, as we take a look at the books, I am going to talk about the PDF and my recommendation, how you can score the PDF as well as the hardcover books themselves. Speaking of the books, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got the two hardcovers for Horror on the Orient Express, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Few things before we dive on in. First off, the fine folks over at Chaosium Inc. were very kind to send me these two volumes as a review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share my thoughts about this campaign with you. These days, it's very important that you know that. Also, if you are a player and you are hoping that your keeper is going to run Horror on the Orient Express, I certainly recommend that you tune out now. There are over 1,000 videos here on the Gaming Gang channel. Feel free, check one of those out because you don't want to spoil your enjoyment of the adventure. I mean, this is a long campaign. This is a massive campaign. You don't want to spoil your enjoyment by watching this video, although I am going to do my best to stay as spoiler-free as possible. So that said, let's take a look at the first volume here. I'm also going to do my best to rock through this so we are not looking at an hour-long review. So one thing I also want to mention, I have people ask me all the time, Jeff, you always say when I'm reviewing an adventure or a campaign, so Jeff, you say, hey, if you're a player, tune out now. And then you're like, oh, okay, so it's just the game masters and I, but you still stay spoiler-free. And it's like, well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't want to ruin the enjoyment of game masters out there as they get to experience for the first time many of the cool beats of an adventure or a campaign. Plus, I also know there are players out there who, regardless if I said, hey, tune out, don't watch this, they're going to hang out and they're going to watch this. And there is nothing worse for a game master or keeper or dungeon master, or whatever you want to call yourself, referee. It's nothing worse than running an adventure or campaign that somebody in your group already knows what's going to happen. Ain't cool, Dooley. All right, so this first volume has a lot of reference material in it. So we're going to get a lot of information about the actual Orient Express, which a lot of people probably don't realize that it was multiple railroads that made up the Orient Express. It wasn't just one train that you got on and rode it all the way to Turkey, all the way to Constantinople and back. It was different railroad companies involved. So we get some information about the train itself, important people on the train, talking about traveling abroad, weapons, and carrying weapons and traveling with weapons during the 1920s in these countries. In Europe, got to point out, a lot of them, it was very, very much frowned upon. So that is something that your player characters are going to have to deal with. So I have to point out, you're going to see little images of train tracks. So if it's just a straight line there, it's talking about that. Okay, so that is a core adventure that's part of the campaign. If we see here, where we see a branch, it's going to tell us, okay, that's optional. It's an optional scenario. Or it'll also represent things that can happen within the adventure that you may want to keep an eye out for, because it can kind of go off onto another path. We see the broken tracks. It's basically saying this could be a point where things really, the wheels fall off. So be prepared. So we're going to break down into different scenarios. Something I always love about Call of Cthulhu Adventures, at least good Call of Cthulhu Adventures, is the way that, especially when they take place in a not modern time, is how the authors really do their best to try to tie that adventure in to that period of time historically. That is one of the strongest suits with Horror on the Orient Express. You really get a feel for each of these places, each of these countries, as well as cities that the adventures are taking place. I love it. I really, really love that a lot. Something I'm not too keen on is the hook to get the adventurers, to bring the investigators on board. It's not very strong. And one aspect of the entire campaign I do want to mention is that there's a lot that's going to be open to the keeper's interpretation. There's a lot here that the keeper is going to have to really fill in. There are things that just don't logically make sense that a good keeper is going to need to iron over, iron out or completely change. And this does require an experienced keeper. That is for sure. So as we're taking a look here, I also want to point out that if you are very familiar with 7th edition Call of Cthulhu, the current edition, you'll notice this book looks nothing like what you see with current Chaosium releases. And one of the reasons is that this box set, this originally came out as a box set in 2014. It was kickstarted, I should say, by Chaosium at that point. It is one of 2 Kickstarters, along with the core book for 7th edition, that were nearly the death knell of Chaosium. And the folks who now run Chaosium are not the folks who ran Chaosium at that point in time, thankfully, because Chaosium seems to be doing very, very well. Everyone that I've dealt with from the company is fantastic, and I think gamers appreciate that as well. But this was laid out in essentially the way that we used to see the adventures laid out for prior editions of Call of Cthulhu. So we don't see it in color. We don't have different colored background. It's just, kind of standard page stock as well. But it is statted for 7th edition. It's important to keep that in mind. This is also reformatted as well. So this is not the exact format that the 2014 box set had. There are typos have been fixed. That's very important because I know some people out there just get really upset about typos. So there are some changes that have been made, but there is not a ton of difference between the 2 editions. One of the reasons why this 2-volume set was made available is that the Kickstarter for the box set was very successful, and you could pick up the box set for about $120, I think was the MSRP thereabouts, or maybe that was the Kickstarter price. But A lot of people wanted to get it. Now, if you try to pick it up on the secondary market, it's going to set you back a lot. So the fine folks over at Chaosium decided, well, what we'll do is we will put together a 2-volume set so that people who want to get the campaign can get it. This originally came out in 1991, and it is one of the most famous adventure campaigns for Call of Cthulhu. I'll be completely honest, full disclosure, I owned the original 1991 box set for Horror on the Orient Express. I never ran it because I didn't like it that much. I'm being honest. I'm being completely honest. All right, so let's go back to talking about the PDFs. So as I mentioned, you can get the PDF over at Drive-Thru RPG for $39.99. But something I want to point out is if you purchase the hardcover set for $89.99, you will get the PDFs absolutely free. Something I should point out with the PDFs is that you have hundreds of pages of handouts and props that are included as well. So the PDF actually clocks in, I want to say like 1,100 pages. Remember, as I mentioned, these two hardcovers together are 768 pages. And of course, all these handouts, what are you going to do? Cut that out? You're not going to cut that out of the book. So, although back in the day we had to, or take the booklets that you had for Call of Cthulhu and you took them to the library and got photocopies made. That's what I did. All right, so let's talk about this campaign. So the hook is kind of weak. So essentially what happens is it starts off with another one of these, an old friend of the investigators needs help. Seen that a billion times. Although I do want to mention that if you have, or if you're considering picking up Reign of Terror, that's actually a secret chapter of Horror on the Orient Express. It has a lot to do with the simulacrum. That's how it's pronounced. I don't know. Which is the the artifact, the piece of the artifact that the player characters are trying to track down. So another aspect is it starts off in London, and 3 people who look exactly the same, who all have identical identification, are found murdered in a hotel room in London. So that's a very strange aspect of the adventure to get started. So this old friend of the investigators, their house is vandalized and put to the torch, essentially, and their friend is all burned. And he draws the player characters in, the investigators in, asking them to track down the pieces of this simulacrum. And that's essentially what the campaign is all about. That's why the player characters are traveling along on the Orient Express. And that is because the pieces of this artifact are all across Europe. And that's why the player characters travel from place to place to place. So this adventure here is actually pretty good. This takes place in the Dreamlands. So as I mentioned, we've got adventures that are core adventures. We've got others that are optional adventures. And we've actually got 19 adventures total. And some of them, I want to say 7 of them, are optional that take place at different points in time. So we have the gas lamp era. We've got the Dark Ages. We have the Roman Empire, the Invictus era for Call of Cthulhu. We've got modern as well. So one thing I should point out, the adventures are kind of uneven. Some are better than others. And another aspect to keep in mind with this is, in my opinion, if a keeper really wants to bring the most out of this campaign, they're going to need to look into some historical aspects of these cities and countries that the player characters are traveling through to really draw this out. So as I mentioned before, one of the aspects of Call of Cthulhu adventures I've always liked that are not set during the modern era is how they historically tie in. And there's a lot of great work that's been done with these books, but I think really to really get the most out of this, the keeper is going to have to invest more time with outside sources of information. So the rest of the book is essentially going to be reference materials. So, but a lot of it's very cool. We've got calendars. We've got maps. Pretty much the big stat blocks for our NPCs are located in this book. We have pre-generated characters as well. We have NPCs that would make very good investigators because you're going to see a good amount of investigator churn in this adventure. This is a pretty lethal adventure. And it's also a very investigative adventure as well. So the action set pieces are going to be rather difficult for the player characters to survive. I will mention that if you've got player characters out there, I should say players out there who don't appreciate the fact that their player characters could die at any moment in a Call of Cthulhu game, this may not be a campaign for them because your players are going to go through player characters. But as I said, we've got all these different pre-generated characters. We've got these NPCs that can be utilized as player characters as well. So, I mean, look at this. Tons and tons. All right, let's take a look at the second volume here. This focuses more on being mainly the adventures. So this is as they get into Italy. So we've got the rise of fascism taking place. There's an adventure that takes place during the era of Invictus. It's later on in the book, but it's actually really good. So here we have Constantinople during the Dark Ages, and then we'll have Constantinople later during the 20s, which is 1923 is when this adventure is set. So as I mentioned, this book here focuses mainly on continuing the campaign. Just kind of giving you an idea. But there is a lot going on in this campaign. There is a lot to keep track as well, especially when we get to the conclusion, to the climax of the adventure. There is timed elements that the keeper is going to have to really pay attention to. You'll notice that there's not a ton of actual line art. This book has more than the first book. The first book had a lot of photographs, whereas we do get a bit more line art here as well. So one aspect that I have to point out is that I could see some player characters wondering, well, why are we going and searching for all of these different pieces of this artifact, which essentially can provide everlasting life? That's the big deal. That's the big deal with this artifact. But the artifact isn't any good unless you have all the pieces. And as the player characters get more pieces, the worse it is for them. So I'm sure that you'll have player characters out there saying, well, why don't we just destroy or get rid of these pieces where they can't be found? Because, of course, the player characters are attempting to find these pieces to the artifact. But there's also a cult who is attempting to track those down as well. And there are quite a lot of villains in this campaign outside of just the big bad. Also, something to keep in mind, this is not a traditional Lovecraftian campaign. This is not a really there. It's not a Cthulhu driven or Cthulhu mythos driven campaign. Some people might like that. Other people may not. But it's important to keep that in mind. Now, of course, there are beats from the Lovecraft stories that are in here. There are set pieces as well. But essentially, this is not an adventure. This is not like Masks of Nyarlathotep, where the player characters are trying to save the world. It's a much smaller, more concise, I guess maybe we'd even say almost more personal campaign than, even though it is spanning all across Europe, there's just not the big, hey, we're saving the world, which I got to be honest, I like, because so many campaigns for Call of Cthulhu revolve around, oh, we got it, we're saving the world. We're saving the world. What the player characters are doing here is they're attempting to prevent this artifact falling into the wrong hands. So we get the end, we get the climax, and I have to admit, I find this is one of the weaker parts of the campaign. And it just doesn't feel epic enough for me. This is something that I would feel that the keepers out there might want to kind of switch up a little bit. Although we do get kind of an epilogue or coda, I think a lot of people will consider it, that takes place in Istanbul today, which of course back in the day was Constantinople. And I think that actually works well as far as giving the conclusion more gravitas. But the problem is it's a modern day scenario. So once again, you're looking at, they are not going to be the main characters for the players. They're not going to be their main characters that they've been playing all through the campaign with. All right, then we get our Kickstarter backers. We get a bunch more handouts. The handouts are really well done. These are really nicely done. A lot of cool maps. A lot of locations. Once again, I should point out, some people don't realize this, but in my opinion, Call of Cthulhu is the perfect theater of the mind role-playing game. It's not really a game that's designed for a bunch of miniatures and things like that, although they're out there, and I do know a lot of people play CFC with miniatures. To me, not so much. It's not what I look for. But that's why we don't see like grids and things like that with the various locales indoors. But once again, all of these little extras are very, very cool. And that is the second volume for Horror on the Orient Express. So let's swing on over to the other camera. I am going to provide you with some final thoughts as well as my review score. Okay, so first off, I got to say, I do like Horror on the Orient Express better than I did in 1991. So it's got that going for it. As a campaign, this is a famous Call of Cthulhu campaign, and there were people who were clamoring for that 2014 box set. So it is really well done. To me, though, it's not on the same level as Masks of Nyarlathotep. But then again, in the tens of thousands of role-playing game adventures that have been released over the years, you can probably count on two hands campaigns and adventures that really do stack up with Masks of Nyarlathotep. I personally think that Horror on the Orient Express is a really good campaign. It is certainly not designed for first-time keepers. In fact, I would recommend that keepers have a good amount of experience running Call of Cthulhu before dipping their toes into this campaign. Because, for one, this is a really long campaign. Even if you discount or don't use those optional adventures, this is still going to be a pretty long campaign. So it is also a campaign that does require a lot of heavy lifting from the keeper. This is not an adventure where everything is laid out for you and kind of spelled out and all these different options that are, presented to you. Say like Children of Fear. That's a good example of an adventure that's got pretty much a lot of angles covered. This doesn't necessarily do that. Once again, as I mentioned, this is also a campaign that I feel to really get the most out of, the keeper has to kind of go outside the box or outside the books in order to get a better feel for the historical period of these various different countries and cities that the players are traveling through. Also, there's some things that just don't necessarily make sense that most keepers are going to sit there and the player characters will be like, what? So the keeper's going to have to sit there and kind of either hand wave it or just come up with something on the fly. There is a lot of flying by the seat of your pants throughout this. I think the biggest knock that people are going to have against this and talk about it a lot, because I have heard it in the past from the previous edition, is it's a railroad. No pun intended. It is mainly a railroad. It is linear. There's not really much sandbox to be had within this. It is point A, point B, point C, point D. Now, there's some player agency within each of the adventures, but a lot of them are really, really scripted. And I know people who are not familiar with Call of Cthulhu really take issue with railroading. That said, good horror adventures normally have railroading. It's just part of the nature of it. You don't get scary adventures with, everybody gets to throw in there. Oh, well, here's my idea. Here's my idea. No, the group ideas just don't play out well in horror role-playing games. So there's always railroading. This just has a lot of it. And some game masters and some players may take some exception to feeling like they don't have much agency within the game. Now, a good keeper can railroad players, and they don't realize they're being railroaded. And a lot of times, I say it all the time, a nice trip on a railroad can provide a lot of enjoyable scenery. So there is that as well. All in all, I like Horror on the Orient Express. As I mentioned, to me, I would end up doing a lot of work to run this effectively. It is a very long campaign. This is not exactly a campaign that you're going to read once and be like, oh yeah, I'm good to go. Absolutely not. There is tons of gameable material in here, though. There is loads that can easily be utilized for other adventures set in the early 1920s, especially if you want a European flavor to them. Got a lot of NPCs that you could steal, a lot of villainous characters that you can steal as well. So there is a lot to build off of from Horror on the Orient Express as well. There's a reason why this is so popular. There's a reason why this is a very, very well-regarded campaign. It is not perfect, though. That said, on a scale of 0 to 10, I give the newest edition, the 2020 2-volume hardcover edition of Horror on the Orient Express, a very, very solid 8 out of 10. I do think it's that good. You might even bump it up a little bit if you are a very experienced keeper who just hasn't happened to run this campaign. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already, and if you do subscribe, ding that bell. It will not only let you know when I upload videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs right here on YouTube. And when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. And until I see you next time, here's hoping that each and every one of you gets to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your very own gang. Oh, you're still here. Well, while you're kicking it, how about subscribing to the Gaming Gang channel? Or seeing the latest episode of the Gaming Gang Dispatch? Or finding out what YouTube recommends you check out here at my channel? And of course, don't forget, get your geek on at thegaminggang.com.